Good morning, and welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute on the campus of UC San Diego presents a number of courses from literature, arts, music, science and technology, medicine, and religion. I would like now to introduce the coordinator for today's class, Clancy Barnes. Clancy.
Welcome, everyone, to the Distinguished Lecture Series at UCSD San Diego. Our guest today is Robert A. Kittle, who is the editor of the editorial page for the San Diego Union-Tribune. We're pleased to have Robert with us this morning. Bob has an interesting career. He's a native of West Virginia. He graduated from West Virginia University, where he was editor-in-chief of his campus daily newspaper. He then went to work in Charleston for the Charleston Daily Mail as their Washington correspondent. And after that, for a period of about 9 years, he was the White House correspondent for U.S. News and World Report. He was stationed in Washington. He was Pentagon correspondent, and I think he was congressional correspondent during that period of 9 years. He was as an editor for U.S. News and World Report. He then came to San Diego in 1986 and was connected with the San Diego Union before the merger as an editorial writer. After the merger, he became the editor of the editorial page and has been here for some 20 years since. Bob has won many awards for excellence in editorial writing. He's also been a political commentator on national TV and national radio. He's been mostly with public broadcasting. He's a frequent commentator on the Jim Lehrer NewsHour on public television. He's also with All Things Considered on public radio, national public radio, and of course he has a weekly show here in San Diego on the local public station. He has won many awards for excellence in writing, as I've said. I know most of you in this room are followers of his editorial and his editorial page and his editorial comments. So without further ado, I present to you on the very provocative subject of America's hypocrisy on illegal immigration, Bob Kittle.
Thank you, Clancy. The topic today that I'd like to engage us all in a discussion of is the problem of illegal immigration in the United States. Now, this is a subject that was much on the President's mind yesterday in Mexico, as you probably know if you've read today's papers. President Calderon and President Bush discussed this as the main bilateral issue between Mexico and the United States. But it's also a subject that I find stirs very deep passions among both Americans and Mexicans and others. But immigration in general in this country is something that I like to say is wrapped in myth and hypocrisy. We embrace the notion, the ideal that we're a country of immigrants. All of us, or our ancestors, came from somewhere else, virtually all of us. And we embrace that ideal as one nation that is a new nation that draws from immigrants around the world and assimilates those immigrants. Now, while we respect that ideal and pay a certain amount of lip service to it, we also, there's a lot of hypocrisy in this issue because we have a lot of resentment about immigration. And this isn't something new, and it's not something just related to Mexico. I want to read to you a report, just a couple of sentences from a congressional report that clarifies this point, I think. The report states, quote, "Those who came to America in the early years were largely composed of honest, industrious people in sympathy with our form of government. They provided a most desirable addition to our population. But can this be said of a large portion of the immigrants we are now receiving? The committee believes not. They have proven a lawless, turbulent class. Many are of a very low order of intelligence, and they come here with no intention of becoming citizens. Now, this congressional finding was written in 1889. Now, this was a time of just about the peak of foreign immigration into the United States. At that time, in 1890, 15% of the U.S. population was foreign-born. Today, the figure is about 12% of the U.S. population is foreign-born. Now, that's legal and illegal immigrants. There are about 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States, and they constitute about 5% of the total workforce, that is, the illegal immigrant population. But if you go back even to colonial times, you find a lot of confusion and dissidence about immigration. While everyone recognized that immigrants were a source of wealth for the new country, a lot of people worried about the mix of immigrants. Ben Franklin famously worried that the United States had too many German immigrants, and he complained that German would become the language of the country if we didn't do something to establish English as the official language. If you move forward through the next century or so, there really were very few attempts by government to regulate immigrants. Immigrants were considered a way of building the country. They were considered a source of wealth, and certainly they were, because the country prospered because of the influx of immigrants to do a lot of the work. But as early as 1796, when the first citizenship law was established, it declared that only free white males would be eligible for citizenship. If you recall, of course, women weren't able to vote in those days, but indentured servants and slaves were explicitly excluded from citizenship. There still, as the decades move forward, were relatively few efforts to restrict immigration, but in 1840, anti-immigrant riots broke out in Philadelphia and New York and several other cities, and it was targeted against the Irish immigrants, who were, of course, at that time being fueled by the potato famines in Ireland, and there was a heavy influx of Irish immigrants and a backlash against them. However, by 1845, New York was the largest Irish city on the planet with 240,000 Irish immigrants. It wasn't until 1882 that Congress passed the first truly restrictive laws to prevent immigration, and those were the Chinese Exclusion Acts. They were passed because during the gold rush and the later years, starting about 1850, there was a heavy influx of Chinese laborers who built the railroads, worked in the mines, and did other heavy work. And Congress in 1882 passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to halt Chinese immigration, but also it stipulated that any Chinese person who went 1 mile outside of the boundary of the United States was not allowed to return. And one of the local impacts that had was that the junks that the Chinese immigrants in San Diego used as fishermen, these were primarily immigrants from Guangzhou province in southern China, who had come to Southern California to fish. And they were fishermen. They collected oysters. They used junks. And in the old pictures going back to about 1890 in San Diego Bay, you see the junks sitting alongside the other sailing ships. But after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, the junks disappeared because the Chinese fishermen could not go 1 mile offshore or they would lose their rights to live in the country. Now, it wasn't until 1943 that the Chinese Exclusion Act was ultimately repealed. I think in this period, and I'm going to get us up to the present here in a moment, but throughout most of this period, immigrants simply arrived in the United States. I think most of your ancestors probably came here legally. You may have some stories to tell, but there were very few restrictions. My own ancestors came from Germany in the 1600s, actually, and their economic opportunity was Kilian Rensselaer, who was a Dutch merchant who had a colony of his own, sort of a private colony in what is now Albany, New York, would give immigrants land in his colony in exchange for getting them to go there. So my ancestors came and basically had the right to land automatically, but they had to work, and the idea was to generate wealth for the colony. That's the way many immigrants came to this country. Later, when my ancestors on my mother's side, my Irish ancestors, came to this country, they came during the potato famines, and they went to Virginia, where they were able, as a small group, to basically become tenant farmers. They lived on a patch of land, produced crops, gave half the crops to the landowner for a period of years, and then they took possession of the land. That's more or less the immigrant story, and I think if any of you want to share those stories about your own ancestors, they're probably quite similar. So we really weren't trying to restrict immigrants for the most part until 1924, when Congress passed the first actual quotas to restrict immigrants from various countries and created the U.S. Border Patrol. In 1924, the effort was to basically direct the quotas toward Northern Europeans. There had been a heavy Italian influx and an influx between 1890 and about 1910 from Eastern Europe, and Congress specifically passed quotas that favored Northern Europeans and restricted Italian immigration and immigration from Eastern Europe. Fast forward to 1942, which was the next prime time of legislation or statutes, as Gerald Ford would say, on illegal immigration. World War II created a labor shortage, of course, in a lot of areas, but in the fields in the West in particular, and in California, there were not enough workers to pick the crops, and crops, of course, are very perishable. You've got to have the workers for a short period of time, but at the right time. So Congress created the Bracero program, which was a guest worker program, and brought in tens of thousands of immigrants from Mexico primarily. And these workers came usually for 3 or 4 months of the year and then returned. Their employers often paid their travel expenses. They lived usually in rather deplorable conditions in bunkhouses and that sort of thing. But it was an economic arrangement that worked well. The workers did not want to stay in the United States permanently. They wanted to make money to support their families in Mexico. And that really started what today, where in San Diego County, we have third and fourth generation workers from Oaxaca who come to pick tomatoes and strawberries. The mix is changing in terms of the temporary influx. But as Felipe Calderon pointed out yesterday in his meeting with President Bush, a third of the population of the Mexican state of Michoacan, which is Calderon's home state, a third of the population is working in the United States. That's true for a number of places. Oaxaca, I'm sure, is similar. Places in southern Mexico that traditionally have provided agricultural workers. After the war ended, the Bracero program continued until 1962. But for the most part, anybody who had participated in the Bracero program was deported. You didn't have the right under the Bracero program to stay permanently. And for the most part, those people were deported after the war, after the labor shortage had disappeared. Now we go to the modern period. In 1986, Congress really wanted to get a grip on the problem of illegal immigration. We had at that time an estimated 3 million illegal immigrants in the United States. So Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, known as IRCA, that was designed to do two things. For the first time, it imposed penalties on workers who knowingly hired illegal immigrants, and the word knowingly was very important. And it granted amnesty, a blanket amnesty, to the 3 million illegal immigrants who were in the country. There was great debate at the time in 1986 about establishing a worker ID card so that employers could know whether the people they were hiring were illegal or not. Civil libertarians on the left and the right objected. The business community objected, in my view, because of the hypocrisy that the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, recognized the value of low-cost labor and didn't want a stringent program where labor was going to be restricted. So Congress passed the Immigration Reform Act, but did not pass any kind of worker ID card. The result of that was, of course, that there are now today millions and millions of bogus documents in circulation. And all an employer has to do is say, well, he showed me a document. In many cases, it's a green card accompanied with a Social Security number. These documents are very easily forged. And because Congress would not require a forgery-proof ID card, the technology for which is readily available, with a biometric, with a thumbprint or an eye print or anything. You could create a card that really could not be forged. So employers continue to hire illegal immigrants. You may have noticed that in the last 25 years, the United States has had a very strong economy. We have had a strong demand for labor. So we don't have 3 million illegal immigrants in the country as we did in 1986. We now have 12 million. They're 5% of the total workforce, but in a number of industries, they constitute up to 25% of the workforce. If you've had a drywall worker in your home, 1 out of 4 drywall workers are here illegally. And I think it's interesting here in Southern California to consider how all of us draw on immigrant labor. And I don't mean just by hiring a contractor to remodel your home or going to a restaurant where there are illegal immigrants washing the dishes and perhaps waiting on tables. I'd just like to ask, how many of you have hired an immigrant, not legal or illegal, I don't care which, but have hired an immigrant to do work at your home, either as a gardener? Exactly. That's my point. We all hire immigrants. Do we know whether they're legal or not? You may ask, and you may even ask to see a green card, but a green card's not going to tell you anything because there are so many forged green cards that the document is absolutely worthless. So Congress now is coming upon, yet again, an effort to solve this problem. Last year, Congress wrestled with this in a very serious way and struck out. The House passed one bill that was an enforcement-only bill that simply ignored the 12 million illegal immigrants who are in the country and said, we'll have, in essence, a work card through the Social Security system, a database, and we'll have stronger enforcement of sanctions against employers, and then we'll build a big fence along the border, 700-mile fence. The CBO estimates, believe it or not, that a 700-mile fence would cost $60 billion. And the reason for that is that the government doesn't own the land along the fence, along the border. That's mostly privately owned land. It would have to acquire the land. It would have to build these very expensive sensors and things. But consider this fact. Half of the illegal immigrants in the United States came to the country legally with a legal visa. They had a right to stay temporarily. Then, when their time expired, they simply stayed. So you could wall off the country with a fence 40 feet high, and you wouldn't solve the problem because more than half then would enter the country legally. It's not difficult to enter the country legally with a visa that allows you to come as a tourist or as a shopper. Every day at the Mexican border, thousands of people cross to come shopping in San Diego County with a day visa. I've often wondered why illegal immigrants take the trouble to cross the desert with a coyote and risk their lives when getting a visa is not difficult. For $15 you can get I think it's a 3-day visa to come, and you're not supposed to go north of 60 miles or something, but I think the whole notion of building a fence, the enforcement-only approach, is just doomed to failure. I also don't think this 700-mile fence will ever be built because the cost is just ridiculous. Congress authorized the fence in an election year, but it's not going to come up with the money to ultimately build it. So we have this dilemma now, and we saw it played out in the streets of San Diego last year, where proponents of illegal immigration, that is, proponents of open, unrestricted immigration, held a number of protests. And in fact, the largest protests that have occurred in San Diego in the last 30 years was one last May, on May Day, that involved mostly young people. They left school, didn't need much of an excuse, I don't imagine, but thousands of kids left school in the middle of the day to join these protests in a march in San Diego. And this was a defining moment in the immigration debate because it really, and it happened in a number of cities on May Day last year, it inflamed a lot of passions and generated a backlash that strengthened the House position, which was enforcement only. And it did it in a number of ways, but the most inflammatory part of these protests were young kids, mostly, often just high school kids, who were chanting this: "We didn't cross the border crossed us." Now, that's a reference to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 that redrew the border and took a third of Mexico, northern Mexico, and made it U.S. territory. Well, I don't think these kids probably appreciated either the history that they were spouting or how inflammatory that is to Americans to suggest that the American Southwest, California included, should really be part of Mexico. This pressed, I think, the House into an even more stringent position. James Sensenbrenner was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, a Republican from Wisconsin, and he was an extreme hardliner. And his unwillingness to cooperate, to compromise with the Senate, which passed a much more liberal bill, really was the reason that the legislation died. So today we have this, again, hypocrisy playing out in a lot of ways. You may be familiar with the fact that the Bank of America recently announced that it would open bank accounts and give credit cards to illegal immigrants. This prompted a few people like Roger Hedgecock, the radio host, to launch a boycott of Bank of America. Well, imagine this. If you boycotted every business that served illegal immigrants, you'd have to boycott the grocery stores and everything else. To me, it's a matter of these 12 million people are here, and it's time that we recognized that and did something about it. Now, the McCain-Kennedy bill, bipartisan bill that was passed by the Senate, provided for a very simple path to amnesty. George Bush has backed off his earlier notion of granting amnesty to 12 million people. He never called it that. That word itself kills any legislation. He now calls it earned amnesty, but he does that. He uses that terminology reluctantly. But the McCain-Kennedy bill would have allowed the 12 million illegal immigrants in the country to earn permanent resident status. The Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative institution, so I tell you that so you can take it for what it's worth, looked at the Kennedy-McCain bill and estimated how many immigrants it would allow into the country over the next 20 years. And it came up with a rather astounding figure of 60 million. Other more conservative and less reliable estimates put the number at 300 million. But even if you figure 50 million new immigrants over the next 20 years, we're a country of only 300 million today. That kind of an influx would create a lot of social consequences. Imagine what happens when you have literally tens of millions of new immigrants in the country who reach retirement age and have spent their lives in low-wage jobs with relatively little education and really have no retirement savings. And in the case of those who, if they're not granted some sort of legal status, they're not even entitled to Social Security. So we come to really looking now at what the solution is, and it is not difficult. We need a worker ID card that is forgery-proof. The technology is available. It can be done. Don't take seriously any immigration reform law that does not come to that issue of dealing with a worker ID card. It would be accompanied with a government database so that any employer would take the card. It would establish that the person who gave it to you is the person represented on the card. There would be a number, an instant computer check, and an employer could know instantly whether the worker he's about to hire is in the country legally or not. That's what has to be done before we solve this problem. Now, frankly, despite the President's comments yesterday in Mexico, and despite the fact that the Congress is now under Democratic control, I don't think this problem is going to be solved. I do not think that this year or next year, which is, of course, a presidential election year, Congress will come to grips with this issue. I don't think the Democrats are going to be, frankly, any more successful at dealing with this than the Republicans were, even though the Democrats in general are more sympathetic to some sort of earned amnesty and are somewhat less sympathetic to the Chamber of Commerce and the fact that we have employers hiring illegal immigrants by the thousands today, and they do it with relative impunity. So I think I can conclude right there on that pessimistic note that we're going to continue with this hypocrisy of cheap labor in the United States that we want and benefit from, while trying to deny the natural rights of citizenship to the people who are providing that immigrant labor. I think this problem is likely to continue until Latin America, and Mexico in particular, become highly much more industrialized and have much more vibrant free market economies that create jobs and keep people at home. As Felipe Calderon, the president of Mexico, said yesterday, he has many of his relatives working in this country. He didn't say whether they were here legally or illegally. He implied that they were here illegally, and he wants to welcome them home. I mean, in Mexico, it's a source of shame that so much of the country, so many people have to leave to get a job to support the family. And if you can imagine the stresses on family life when the breadwinner has to leave to go to the United States. We have now the worst possible situation because we know, because of Gatekeeper and other things that have been somewhat effective in stopping just walking across the border, we have a situation where more and more illegal workers come to this country. They can't go home the way they did before to see their families. It gets too difficult. So they smuggle their families in too. And so we're really spurring the problem by this hypocritical, lawless system where workers can readily find a job and employers don't hesitate to hire illegal immigrants. Now, I'd love to hear your questions and maybe some of your stories and some of your thoughts on this issue, and maybe we can get a dialogue going. We'll begin right back there, please. Yes,
Do you
ma'am.
foresee that we might have a constitutional amendment to change the fact that all children born here are automatically citizens? This seems to me it would be a nice first step for the border states.
Well, that's a very interesting issue. To answer your question specifically, I don't see the momentum in Congress to send that constitutional amendment to the states. My own view is different than yours. I think that it would be a mistake. What the questioner is referring to is the fact that if you are here illegally, but your child is born in this country, he is automatically a citizen under the 15th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War to guarantee that all slaves, anybody else who had formerly not had citizenship but was born in this country, would have the full rights of citizenship. That applies to anybody born on U.S. soil, essentially. There are some technical exceptions if you happen to be a foreign diplomat here, but in general, if you have a child in this country, that child is automatically a citizen. And the opponents of this process, refer to these children as anchor babies and assert that illegal immigrants come here to have their babies here. They come here illegally so that their babies will be born in the United States so that the child will qualify for welfare because the child is a citizen, even though the parents would not qualify. The mother would not qualify if the mother is here illegally. I frankly don't think I don't think people come here to have babies to get welfare. I think people come here to get jobs. To me, it's kind of a moral issue, and most political issues really are moral and to some extent. But I really hate the notion of passing the sins of the father or the mother onto the child. One thing none of us had any control over is where we were born. The second, more practical reason that I don't support this amendment, and Congressman Brian Bilbray from San Diego is one of the leading proponents of a constitutional amendment to do this, to deny citizenship to children born in this country of illegal immigrants. I think as a practical matter, what happens if you deny citizenship to these children? It seems to me you're just going to create an underclass of people who, in this case like their parents, are illegal, who don't have the right to a lot of things. The Union-Tribune, on our editorial page, we were strongly against Proposition 187 because the main effect of Proposition 187 about 15 years ago would have been to deny the children of illegal immigrants the right to an elementary and secondary education. I think that's the dumbest social policy we could ever devise, to deliberately close off education to millions of children in this country. We would simply create an underclass. So this issue comes up every year in Congress, but you know what? It has not advanced to the stage where it got a serious hearing and where the judiciary committees in the House and Senate would take it up seriously. So I don't see, to answer your question, any momentum to getting that actually sent to the states for potential ratification.
I bring to you the fact that coming from, we both have different viewpoints of what you just were talking about as far as anchor babies are concerned. Having worked in social services for 30 years in San Diego, I would not agree with your position that they didn't come across the border to have a baby.
Do you have some, I'm curious, do you have some anecdotal evidence, or have you dealt with
Of
cases
women
of
waiting
women?
until they're in labor to come across at to the county hospital. In the olden days, that's what it was called.
Mm-hmm.
And yes,
And tell me their motivation. I mean, since you've had
to
some
have
firsthand
a child in the United States, because at that point they were eligible for welfare. And not only did the woman, the mother, stay, she was able to bring all of the other children. This is an instant anchor into this country. And the motivation was that, that she could, the child should not be deprived of the parent. The question was, if that was true, then the child could go back to Mexico just as well as staying here. And that none of the other children would be able to come, and the aunts and uncles and all the different people that came. And it seemed at that point that Bill Bray was the only one that really understood the problem. But, okay, so that's my answer to that.
Okay.
What I wanted to ask you about is, particularly in the building trade, what happened to the unions that they collapsed so completely that almost everybody in the building is now an illegal that's earning less money than a union person? What happened to the unions in that industry?
I don't know in any detail about specific unions in specific industries. In general, the unions have supported a liberal immigration policy because many of those illegal immigrant workers are union members as well. The influx of labor cheap labor probably made it far more difficult for unions to negotiate higher wages and benefits in industries such as construction, in the home construction business, where there is such an influx of cheap labor, the unions don't have much negotiating clout. I think that's probably true. But I really can't, you'd have to look at it industry by industry. Unions in general in this country in the last 30 years have declined in influence and in numbers, with the exception of government, where unions are stronger now in the public sector than they ever have been, as we know in San Diego.
Could you give us an insider's view of what goes on in the Union-Tribune's editorial board, how are they developed, who's on the board? And some of us skeptics used to think that the editorials in the Union-Tribune were sort of apologists for the administration, but lately you seem to be more critical. Are you aware of that transformation?
Well, let me answer your first question first. The editorial page is distinct from the rest of the newspaper by design, as it is at most newspapers. There is an editorial board that sets the policy that we argue for in the unsigned editorials on the editorial page, which are the position of the newspaper. When I say the newspaper, I mean primarily the publisher, who owns the newspaper, and the editorial board. So the way the process works, it begins on Monday morning at 11 a.m. We have a meeting of the full editorial board with the publisher, David Copley. And the editorial board consists of David Copley, the editor of the paper, Karin Winter. I'm the editorial page editor. I'm on the editorial board. The senior editor for opinion is on the editorial board. The cartoonist is on the editorial board. We have a staff, Steve Green, we have a staff of 4 full-time editorial writers, all of whom are on the editorial board. And it's a group of about 12. And on Monday mornings, with the publisher, they're primarily to observe, but to offer whatever views he cares to, and as owner of the paper, his view carries a lot of weight. We discuss the issues of the day, and we discuss what will play out during the week, and then a smaller group of the editorial board, meaning the editorial writers and I and a couple of others, meet every other day of the week to flesh things out. Anything that would be of high importance or controversy, the publisher, we make sure the publisher signs off on. And we form our views really based by among that group of about a dozen people who have strong passions about issues, and we have a great deal of disagreement. I'd like to think that our editorial page is honest. That is, we are not we are not wedded to the Bush administration as a partisan entity. We're not a partisan entity. We are moderately conservative to very conservative among some members of the editorial board. We are mostly Republicans, but not entirely Republicans on the editorial board. That means that in general, we're going to be supportive of Bush administration policies. But if you even look at today's paper, we're harshly critical of the Justice Department for firing Carol Lam and raising some important issues about whether she may have been fired because her investigation in the Duke Cunningham matter was extending to Jerry Lewis, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. And this is based on a memo that I got a copy of yesterday, one of the emails that was released in a big document dump by the White House to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. The best way to look at it, we really do try to take issues one by one. Where Bush has sort of stuck to what we think is right, we've agreed with him, and in many cases we disagree. An issue that has evolved quite interestingly on our editorial board, as it has in the country, is the war in Iraq. We wrote, and I wrote most of the editorials, a score of editorials in the run-up to the war saying, whoa, slow down, don't be in any rush to resort to military force. In January of '03, Colin Powell, Secretary of State, testified before the UN Security Council and laid out the case for the weapons of mass destruction. That was the turning point for us. When that occurred, that had a huge impact on us, and we decided, and we supported, that if Saddam Hussein did not allow the inspectors back in and voluntarily comply with the UN mandate, then military force would have to solve the problem. Now, we now know that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell has bitterly recanted much of his testimony on that day, which he believed to be solid, but which we now know the intelligence was heavily slanted to reach the conclusions. I frankly believe Powell in that. I think he was sincere in what he was saying. I think much of the Bush administration believed it. So we supported the war, and we supported, we got into the war, and we supported the efforts to rebuild Iraq. About, I would say, 6 or 8 months ago, we started being more skeptical and being more critical and recognizing that the policy was not working. Once a civil war erupted, my own fundamental thinking on this was that we were in big trouble because we had unleashed a civil war. If the Iraqis themselves were not going to seek a political reconciliation, we could not impose it. There's not enough military force in the world to impose peace on Iraq if the Sunni and the Shia, and to a lesser extent the Kurds, want to wage a civil war. So to bring it up to the most recent development, and I'm kind of boring you with this one issue because it kind of explains how the editorial board functions. We were very critical when Bush adopted the surge policy. We felt it was the wrong thing to do, and we said so. All of that said, we're now grappling, as the rest of the country is, as you are, with how do we resolve this mess. An immediate pullout is not the answer in my view, but we've got to find a way to slowly hand over responsibility to the Iraqis, and if they're going to have a civil war, then we just need to get out of the way. Yes, sir.
As I read your paper, you are conservative, and you have the right to be conservative, but very often you let your partisanship even trump your conservatism. Example, when we were discussing the strong mayor,
yes,
you were all for the strong mayor, so long as you thought it was going to be Dick Murphy. When you thought it was going to be Donna Fry, you switched positions, and you were no longer for the strong mayor. You now have a system of government of mayor and council, and traditionally in this country, when you have an executive and a legislative body, they implement the policy of separation of powers and checks and balances. Unfortunately for the Union-Tribune, the council is dominated by Democrats, and the mayor is a Republican. You all chafe at the fact when the council questions the executive. We've seen the results of that kind of operation in Washington for the last 6 years. It's disastrous. The legislature has the obligation to question the executive, to make certain that what he does. And yet you criticize the council for doing just that. And the other thing is you have two villains that you love to indict some way. One is Donna Fry, and the other is Mike Aguirre. And when you ran your editorials on the Kroll, that $20 million Kroll report, the Kroll report talked about the Gang of Five, but it also talked about the Gang of Four. And the difference between the Gang of Five and the Gang of Four was Donna Fry was not in the Gang of Four. Yet when you discuss the gang, you put Donna Fry at the head. In fact, in one of your editorial columns, you even had a picture of her in your column, which you don't often do. Why do you do that?
I didn't write down all those questions, but let me see if I can thread my way through all of them. On the issue, because you're mistaken on a couple of points, but let me explain. On the issue of the charter reform going to a strong mayor form of government, I've been at the paper for 20 years on the editorial page. We were arguing for that kind of reform for 20 years. We urged the city council to put that charter reform package on the ballot in the spring of, I believe it was '04 that we passed it. It was the spring of the election year. We urged them to put it on the ballot. About 2 months before the election, I mean, we were strong proponents for it. David Copley, who owns the newspaper, thought that it was not a good deal. And he was concerned that it was going to allow, not Donna Fry to become mayor, but it was going to allow certain economic interests to have more control at City Hall. And he raised these doubts, and he decided that we should oppose it. And I had the delightful task of writing an editorial to explain why we opposed this after we had urged that it be put on the ballot in the first place. So that's the way a newspaper can function sometimes, or not function, however you care to look at it. That's that issue. Now, when it comes to Donna Fry and the Gang of Five, the Kroll report found that 5 members of the City Council were negligent in their handling of the fraudulent bond issues. They were negligent. They did not do their job of due diligence and handle their fiduciary responsibility. The 5 members included Donna Fry. Now, I'm not sure which Gang of Four you're referring to. Donna likes to say that she didn't vote for the pension increase, and in the very end she did not. However, she did vote for it earlier, and she did vote for the very worst aspect of the pension increase in 1992, which was the so-called presidential benefit. And that was, in my view, a bribe to the heads of the 3 unions. It provided, as part of the pension increase, there was a special side deal that the 3 union leaders would be able to count their union salaries, that is the police, fire, and the MEA, the big union for municipal white-collar employees. They would be able to count, these 3 presidents would be able to count their union dues toward their city pension. This would increase their pension benefits by hundreds of dollars a month. In the case of Ron Satoff, I think it was $480 a month that he was going to get. And the measure provided that it would apply only to these 3 individuals, not to their predecessors or to their successors. And the reason for that was that Ron Satoff basically was the most important person on the pension board. He was the head of the firefighters union. And he was the one who was going to get this done. It's one of the reasons that he has been indicted. I don't know that he'll be convicted, but he's been indicted on this. Donna voted for that. That was a measure that was handled. They discussed it in closed session. They put it on the consent calendar, which meant it was to be a non-controversial item, stack of paper this deep, which the reporters glanced through. They voted in all together. I don't see Donna Fry as having clean hands in all of this. You know, the degree to which she deserves our criticism is significant in my view. We have disagreed with her policies on a number of things. Now, to answer the last part of your question, which was something about we like the mayor because he's a Republican. Well, we did endorse this mayor, and we thought Donna Fry's proposal for $1.5 billion tax increase to pay for these disastrous pensions was a terrible idea. And we did endorse Jerry Sanders. The issue that I believe you're referring to is one that came up within the last month. About a month ago, the City Council repealed, at Donna Fry's instigation, the City Council repealed an ordinance that it had passed last year, giving the mayor explicit authority to streamline government city departments, to lay off people, to reorganize. And he wanted a specific ordinance to do that, and the council approved it. About a month ago, Donna Fry came forward because of the issue of a swim program and another program. There were two programs that the mayor stopped funding. They were in the budget, more or less, in a broad way. But he, in trying to save some money, eliminated, for example, a swim program that was costing I believe, my memory's a little foggy, but about $120,000 a year, and it was only serving about 30 kids. And he felt that was not a good use of the money, and he stopped spending money on it. He didn't say anything to the city council before he did it. City council started getting complaints, and they rushed in and to say, well, now under this new charter, who has what right? And there is fuzziness, and this needs to be clarified with later charter amendments. But Donna Fry said at the time that she offered a motion to repeal this measure, that had been passed earlier to allow the mayor to streamline city departments, she insisted in the new ordinance that the mayor could not make any changes in the budget that would affect service levels. Now, the mayor and the city council passed this on a 5-3 vote, surprisingly. The mayor pointed out quite accurately when he stood there and asked them not to do it, that measure would prevent the police chief from shifting forces from one side of town to another to deal with a big police disturbance. It would prevent the fire chief from moving fire companies around to respond to a big fire because it would affect service levels. And her measure said that the mayor may not do this unless he has city council approval first. So I wrote a very stinging editorial that I think you're probably referring to, that I called Donna Fry's City Council, and criticized this notion that the mayor, the new strong mayor, which the voters voted for, would not have the authority to streamline city departments or even to do anything that would affect, quote, service levels. After that, and in that same editorial, I urged Scott Peters, who's the president of the council and who voted against this measure, to try to work out a compromise. He did, in fact, reach an agreement with the mayor on how the mayor could continue the streamlining program and would report back to the city council for approval if he cut any department's budget by 10% or more, or $4 million, whichever was greater, or lesser, I believe. So a compromise was reached, and Scott Peters is a Democrat, and I wrote an editorial about 10 days ago praising Scott Peters, a Democrat, for playing a constructive role here. This will go back to the city council. As for our biases, if you look on the page preceding the editorial page today, we gave Donna Fry space to argue her point of view, which is the opposite of ours, about why the mayor should not, why she believes the mayor should not have this authority. We think he should. But so we gave Donna Fry about, 25 column inches on our pages today to argue her point of view, which is different than our own. So I hope that answers the questions. I don't think we're as partisan as you do, to be quite frankly, especially when it comes to the city council. Yes, sir.
I'm concerned about a possible reconciliation between the Union-Tribune and Mike Aguirre. When Mike comes out here, he always sounds like such a reasonable, well-informed, generous, bright guy. And you sound the same way. What's the prospect?
Did you just compare me to Mike Aguirre?
Oh, you're both very bright, you're both very glib, and you're both very sound in your arguments. What's the prospects of some sort of reconciliation, or is it just you're just not going to get along?
Well, let's start at the beginning. We endorsed Mike Aguirre's election when he was running in 2004. We felt his opponent was rather weak, and the editorial in which we endorsed him, I laid out a lot of caveats because I've known Mike for a long time and I've seen his destructive side. And we laid out in endorsing him how he could be a constructive force at City Hall if he chose to be sensible. I sat in the courtroom some years earlier in the mid-90s when he argued on behalf of Bruce Henderson the case for why the expansion of Qualcomm Stadium was illegal. Not bad policy, you can argue whether it was good policy or bad, but he said it was illegal. The judge threw out his arguments, didn't give him a second look because the arguments were so outlandish in terms of the law. We supported Mike Aguirre's efforts in the first year that he was in office to uncover the problems. As I like to say, to take the lids off of the trash cans and look at where all that corruption, all those problems were at City Hall. And he played a constructive role in uncovering the problems, in issuing reports that detailed a lot of the problems. That was a very constructive thing. He had our support through all of that on the editorial page I'm referring to. The Kroll report came along in the second year of Mike's tenure, and Mike decided to try to kill the Kroll investigation. And he did everything he could to kill the Kroll investigation. And that's where we parted company and started having differences of opinion. I would like to think that there are differences of policy opinion, but Mike has done a number of things. I mean, I won't try to get into all the details, but on the big picture, I mean, he has single-handedly driven the Chargers from San Diego. Maybe you think that's a good idea. He's done a number of things that I think were irresponsible. One of the more recent ones, we have this problem of the Sun Road Development Company putting up a building near Montgomery Field that is too tall and is a safety hazard. We urged that the building not be put up that tall and said it ought to go. Mike Aguirre had the same view. But when Mike didn't get everything that he was wanting on this issue, he rushes out and held a press conference and said, I'm asking the U.S. attorney to investigate not only the Sun Road officials for their violations of federal law, but also the city administrators. There's absolutely no evidence of illegal wrongdoing there. It was a stupid decision. The city should never have even allowed them to continue on a conditional basis, which it did. It was terrible policy. But there were no criminal violations. I thought it was highly irresponsible of him, and an abuse of his position as the city attorney, to throw around groundless charges of illegal activity by people for whom there was no evidence of illegal activity. So we disagreed with him strenuously as he tried to shut down the Kroll investigation. We disagreed with him when the mayor came forward. We endorsed the many, many recommendations in the Kroll report that they needed to be implemented to reform City Hall. Mike opposed them and wanted to kill them. And his own view was that we shouldn't have an independent audit committee, that he should be the audit committee, and a number of things like that. He's done a number of things that we disagree with. We take them issue by issue. This week, I mean, the Chargers won't even speak to Aguirre. They say that they will not even consider a stadium deal in San Diego because Mike Aguirre makes it impossible for them to get development partners. Whether it's true or not, that's their position. Mike this week held a press conference in which he issued a lot of inflated numbers about what he said the Chargers are costing the taxpayers of San Diego. His numbers were way, an order of magnitude above any numbers that anybody else has. I'm not sure how he compiled such high numbers, but he issued a press release. He's entitled to do this. And he said in part of this issue, as he blasts the Chargers again, he said, now, I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, and I really think it would be a good idea if the Chargers started paying the interest on the bonds for the stadium expansion, which was not part of the deal. That is, part of the deal was they would pay rent. There was the horrendous ticket guarantee that offset their rent, et cetera, et cetera. The deal itself is not a good deal for the city necessarily. But, I mean, how counterproductive can it be to rush out, blast the Chargers, and then say, now I'd like you to start giving us $5.7 million a year more than you're obligated under your contract with the city? I can't take that seriously. You know, to be quite honest, I've also tried to make these disagreements with Mike Aguirre policy disagreements. We disagree with his position on things. His tactics, however, we sometimes have to criticize as well because his tactics are so outlandish. You know, he is, frankly, I won't refer you to his blog site, but it's mostly about me. I mean, it's about what a terrible man I am. Well, you know, that's the way Mike is. And so, unfortunately, while I think he has tremendous potential to help move this city forward, he's made himself an obstructionist. And I'm afraid he's a big part of the problem now, instead of part of the solution.
I gather you're not going to support him for re-election.
Well, you know, the thing is, and we have to face this every time we make an endorsement, and we endorse in every election. We interview all the candidates, the scores of candidates, and it's enough to sometimes make you think democracy was not such a great idea. But we have to choose between two candidates. We were not enthusiastic about Mike Aguirre, but we thought he was better than his opponent. So whether we would endorse him for re-election will all depend on who his opponent is. I mean, it doesn't depend entirely on that, but that's a factor. I can't say whether we would endorse him without knowing who his opponent is. Thank you.
Tapi saya amat mencintai. Di mana kata-kata dan perasaan.